Let's face it, thick textbooks that slam my eyes shut the second I open them are not the right delivery method for history lessons. If the past doesn't want me to repeat it, then the least it could do is present itself in a way that's even a tiny bit interesting. Luckily, documentarians like Noclip do a great job of this, but sometimes the games they cover are out of print or unavailable digitally, which leaves my interest piqued for something I might never be able to experience. But what if documentaries evolved to take the form of the medium they're covering? Well, welcome to the future of experiencing the past, in the first of Digital Eclipse's Gold Master series, starting with the Making of Karateka, or Karateka? Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of BacklogBusters, where I'm busting out my gaming backlog with the help of your suggestions and finding out if these games are still worth playing today. I've been dying to talk about this game ever since I started playing it, while simultaneously wondering if this was too new for me to actually cover on my backlog, and questioning, what even is a video game? Because more than half of my time was spent without my hands anywhere near the controller. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Why are we even talking about this today? Well, I'm always on the lookout for any remasters, re-releases, ports to cover, because I love ending a video with a simple way to check the game out for yourself, which is very infrequent. So I always keep an eye on what Digital Eclipse puts out, as they've re-released great collections like the Mega Man Legacy Collection, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Cowabunga Collection, and many, many more. But I'd only ever picked up collections where I had fond memories of the games included, or at least a strong recommendation. So I immediately wrote off the 50th anniversary Atari collection they released in 2022, because maybe it's just me, but I've got not so fond memories as a kid of grabbing various Atari, Midway, Konami, and other classic collections, boasting dozens of games for the price of one, only to grow bored with the historic but sometimes overly simplistic games. But then I started to hear players describe a timeline and a more historic presentation with context to each game's significance in the greater history of video games, which sounded much more interesting, but I was still hesitant. Then, on August 29, 2023, the Making of Karateka was released with another round of praise for the presentation. And not to get bogged down in a discussion of how much a collection of older games should cost, but Karateka was half the price of the Atari collection. So I decided to see how this game, that's older than any I've covered on the channel before, which I have zero nostalgia for, and next to zero knowledge of, holds up. Excuse me, but what even is Karateka, and why are we leaving collections featuring multiple games behind for just one? Well, Karateka was the first commercially released game that Jordan Mechner created. And if that name doesn't ring any bells, it didn't for me. Mechner went on to create Prince of Persia 1 and 2, The Last Express, and Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. Now, I've played a tiny bit of the very first Prince of Persia, and I remember being really impressed by the animation, at least the little I could see before falling to my death over and over. Well, Karateka pioneered that fluid animation first, while also being notable for its cinematic qualities not seen in many, if any, games of its time. All of that information could easily be covered in a documentary format, and probably has been, especially with Mechner having published a whole book's worth of journals back in 2012 that documented this game's creation. But that's where this game gets interesting. When you boot it up, things are broken up into 5 chapters, with each featuring a timeline to move through. And forget about how most collections dump you into just a scrolling list of titles. We're going on a journey here. The first stop on this timeline is a short documentary-style video that's full of industry veterans giving you a tease of what's to come, a sneak peek of why Karateka is important. Then some scene setting with pictures of Mechner with his family and first computer. Then we have our first detour as we get to zoom and pan around Mechner's first publishing agreement as a 16-year-old. We then get to view his graph paper sketches of an asteroids-like shooter and a physical piece of mail with suggestions to better differentiate his game from the asteroids it draws inspiration from. But what's this? You can play that prototype. And sure, it stutters, sprites flicker, and it isn't the most exciting thing to play, but you can experience it if you want. But Mechner wasn't done. He received feedback, applied it, and here's another version of that same game you can play and see how it progressed. Now, it is worth bringing up, these are prototypes, in-progress snapshots of development, and some of them aren't all that fun, and certainly aren't polished. That's why the wise folks at Digital Eclipse give you the option to just watch as the game plays itself, which can be paused, fast-forwarded, and at any point, you can choose to pick up from that exact moment of gameplay. We're not even halfway through the first chapter, and I was shocked at how much flexibility you have. You can read whole documents, play through games, and inspect every drawing. Or you can read the synopsis, skip pages, watch a bit of gameplay, and move on once you've got the gist. Have you ever watched a documentary that you wish went more into the weeds on something you found interesting? You can. Or have you ever watched a documentary and wished it was a short film rather than a series to speed past the setup or things you weren't interested in? You can. But in addition to images, videos, and gameplay, we've also got a whole Karateka music analysis from the host of Strong Songs, Kirk Hamilton. And as we move towards the starring game, a commentary by Mecher and his father as they narrate an entire playthrough of the retail version of Karateka as well. There's even an extraordinarily well done example of the rotoscoping techniques Mecher used to take video footage, turn it into sketches, then convert it into the sprite-based animation of the characters in this game. It is such a detailed journey through the highs and lows of Mecher's process of creating games and eventually Karateka that's presented with such care and with the flexibility to be as hands-on or off as you'd like, letting you decide how much and what to latch onto. As much as I'd love to continue gushing about the historical edutainment properties of this release, I should talk about the actual game or games included here. You can, at any time, go to a list of all the included games that you'd chronologically encounter if moving through the timeline view. It's filled with various snapshots of development for Mecher's games leading up to and ending with Karateka. Of course, you can play through the original release of Karateka for the Apple II, and even learn about the porting process of that game to the Commodore 64 and Atari 8-bit, both of which you can also play through, which I found fascinating as it isn't a small change in frame rate or one hardly noticeable graphic effect that you might see when comparing the cross-platform games of today. These computers feature differences in the quality and complexity of the music that could be played, differences in the colors available, and smoothness of gameplay as different hardware capabilities were worked around. But let's just focus on that original Apple II release I played through. Digital Eclipse gives you the ability to save and load as well as rewind time. It also includes scans of the original manual, which every single re-release of a game from now on should start doing. It features 2 control types and different display modes so you can tailor your experience for a more classic look, simulating how it would display on an Apple II of the time, or turning all that off to display the sharpest pixels depending on what you prefer. You can also see what happens when a floppy disk was inserted upside down, which flips the game upside down, which is both fascinating and very confusing. Graciously, they included an enhanced frame rate toggle to push past some of the Apple II's limitations for slightly more responsive gameplay. But how does it play? Well, it's a little odd. By default, you have 2 buttons in addition to a control stick or arrow keys, and you'll switch in and out of standing and fighting stances. If you're standing, you're able to run, but if you so much as touch an enemy while not in the fighting stance, you'll die instantly. Standing also allows for a courteous bow before the fight starts, but if you take one step too close and enter their personal bubble, don't expect a response. When in fighting stance, you'll creep through the stage, but be able to throw fists and feet by hitting the punch or kick button along with a direction. Up and punched as a high punch, down and kicked as a low kick, and so on. I changed this almost immediately to the 6-button layout that lets you hit a specific button for each type of punch and kick, which I'm really glad they included because sometimes I had trouble triggering the specific attack I wanted. The loop is running forward, fighting an enemy, and repeating this as you make your way through Akuma's castle and attempt to rescue Princess Mariko. Fights feel surprisingly tense, feeling like a fighting game but with a more strategic pace, as you try to land attacks through momentary openings in your opponent's defenses. Tense fights lead to stress as you make your way further into the castle, fighting more competent guards, birds, and metal gates, with any death sending you right back to the start. This happened very often as I tried to learn any discernible patterns, good combos to use, or just when to stop running. And I found it much more enjoyable than I expected, with the one more run feeling taking hold very quickly. Because this isn't just a set of static fights to memorize, it's a tug of war. If you stay in a fight long enough, both you and your opponent slowly gain health back. But if you thought like I did, oh, I'll just stand here and heal after a fight, the game makes it very clear. Enemies are endless and will keep running at you if you don't manage to exit an area before a new enemy enters. So the success of a fight isn't a time to catch your breath. It's a time to run as fast as you can towards an exit before someone catches you. And if you got pushed back by an advancing enemy in the last fight, then you've got more ground to make up. It's not a game of memorization. It's a game where you swim against the tide with all of your might, looking for openings to break through the wave of enemies and swim forward. It's equal parts thrilling and nerve-wracking, which constantly left me wanting to try again. It's also worth calling out how visually impressive this game and especially its animations are, in addition to the cinematic qualities that were all very much ahead of their time. The crawling text of the intro, the initial cutscenes as Mariko is forced into her cell, even during gameplay as you run forward, the camera cuts between you and your approaching enemy to build anticipation. As you progress further, you'll get glimpses of Mariko trapped in her cell as she seems to look up and acknowledge some commotion in the castle as you make your way closer. But sometimes the fluid animation makes it hard for me to slow down and stop before an obstacle. Sometimes it feels like my attacks aren't quite responding to my inputs, or maybe the animations of some attacks take longer to reset. The single life also starts to feel more brutal, as finding the timing to pass through a gate without getting impaled quickly became one of the most frustrating moments of my time with this game. Sometimes the game also hides enemies completely off screen, the only hint being a new life bar that pops up at the bottom, as you're forced to coax them into the viewable area. It's a difficult game, not aided by the hardware of the time. Even with the enhanced frame rate, it still feels sluggish. Luckily for me at least, the saving system is there to let you retry certain fights or gate encounters, not from the start of the game each time. I still feel like I'm misunderstanding some part of how combat works. The most reliable strategy I found was kicking enemies in the head and then shins as they moved closer, then repeating this until they fell. But the final boss is a much better fighter and made this and most of my strategy very difficult. Meanwhile, punches felt useless because you had to get too close for my comfort, and it's not like there are enough animation frames for me to detect a wind-up or any tell that let me learn how to counter specific attacks. But maybe I'm just missing something. I had to push myself to finish this game, so I kicked shins and retried fights over and over to make it to the end. But it wasn't pretty, and without the saving functionality, I definitely would not have had the patience to finish this, at least in time for this video. But there's just something about it that keeps pulling me back in to try to make it further without any of the saves. So for me, this lands in the 2 out of 5 nostalgia needed slot because while it's no doubt a historic release with systems, animations, and gameplay that are legitimately impressive and addictive, the limitations of the hardware are something you have to come to terms with, even with the slight performance boost. And it makes it a little hard for me to recommend to someone coming to this game years later as their first experience with Karateka. But wait, don't go. There's more, like a lot more. As with most creative works that are tied to a budget or silly things like deadlines, there were enemies, levels, and graphical elements that were cut throughout the development of Karateka. Luckily, Digital Eclipse provides a brand new, remastered version of Karateka, which restores much of that cut content, adds a list of achievement-like goals, and features a commentary by Digital Eclipse's president, Mike Micah, on the process of making this new version, which is incredibly interesting. The animation is slightly enhanced while keeping Mechner's original keyframes, but adding in things like a tree that was cut from the original release, but now with rustling leaves, giving perspective to bridges and gateways, adding subtle reflections and extra detail to the existing stages, in addition to implementing cut stages, ideas, and enemies. Gameplay-wise, it feels so much better than any of the original releases. There's still wind up and wait behind your attacks, fights are still tense and tough, but it just feels so much more responsive to me. I could consistently throw out multiple attacks in a row, and these combos get tallied down. It also felt easier to get in and out of standing and fighting stances, and to slow down and come to a complete stop after running. In the commentary, Micah mentions wanting to keep the feel of the original, and make improvements that don't stray too far from Mechner's vision. Playing this remaster with its extra responsiveness, smoothness, and other improvements just made it so much easier to learn and finally improve. This in turn makes the tug-of-war nature of the game even more satisfying and addictive, as I never had feelings that the limitation of the hardware, real or imagined, were holding me back. With all those lessons applying to the Apple II release as well, making progress in both games more achievable by training in the remastered version. However, what most helped with forward progress is the addition of lives. If you die, that body stays on the ground and your new body walks in from the left of the screen to continue the fight. Which let me laugh at my own pain as I piled up an embarrassing amount of bodies during fights against inanimate objects like gates, as well as vicious pet birds. In the commentary, Micah does mention the suggestion for extra lives coming from Chris Kohler during development, and even though Micah disagreed with a single life being unbearable, they were added for modern game players, which I guess is me, because I'm so glad they included this as it actually let me experience the full game. After which I finished the game again with the commentary on, and quicker than before, as I learned from past mistakes. Also, these lives are optional, but I feel they reiterate my feelings about this documentary game as a whole, in that you're able to approach it your way. Play with no lives, play with a maximum of 11, or anywhere in between. The lives allowed me to experiment more against different enemies and come to terms with the systems better than just fighting the same starting enemies over and over with my one life. Also, these lives do not guarantee a win. It is very possible to receive a game over even with all 11 lives and be sent right back to the cliff. Watching, reading, and playing through all these documentary elements give you so much context and understanding of this game, which led to its creation and let you see the legacy it left. Finally culminating in this remastered version, which did what I would have thought impossible going in. It gave me the excitement, the anticipation, the awe that has to be the absolute closest feeling to playing this game on release day, something I never would have been able to achieve having not even been born when this originally released. I consider this a 4 out of 5, a weathered gem. It still might not appeal to everyone, there are frustrations, and if you're not as enamored by the history, creation, and legacy of this game, it might not have as strong a hold on you. But I do think this remastered version is the best way to play Karateka, and it's a game you should at least give a try, even if it's just one small stop on this documentary tour. I'm intentionally not going into too much detail on the documentary portion because I really want anyone who's interested to go pick up this game and experience the making of Karateka for themselves. But in case it wasn't clear from the title, the story cuts off shortly after Karateka. We don't get to see or play Prince of Persia or The Last Express, and I am on the edge of my seat, hoping that we get to see the rest of Mechner's journey, because the number of notes, physical mail, builds, and just historical documents that have been saved is astounding, and I need to know more details, which I know exist, as Mecher has a book on the making of Prince of Persia, which I now have, and I am very excited to read, but will be more excited to maybe watch and play someday, please? Oh, and I might have forgotten to mention that there's another entire remastered game in the making of, which might just be the Geometry Wars sequel I know some of you have been hoping for. Overall, I'm just so excited to see what's next for this Gold Master series, after the exceptional quality of this first title, which managed to turn someone with zero nostalgia into a fan of Karateka, a game I never would have played otherwise. And I might be a fan of a whole new series of games soon, as Digital Eclipse has announced the second in this series will be focusing on Jeff Minter, who I know equally little about other than recognizing the name Tempest in the list of games he's worked on. So maybe we'll be here talking about that series in 2024. I'm sorry to have to ask, but do you have a few more minutes? Because there's a whole other Karateka game that I finished. This is the remake across iOS, PS3, 360, and Steam, which seemed poised to appeal to a wider audience and bridge the gap between the original Karateka fans and more modern gamers. And I have a hazy memory of this box art sitting on the digital shelves of the Xbox Live Arcade back in 2012 and not even trying the demo. It didn't review especially well at the time and has been removed from most digital stores, but it's still an interesting turn in this story. Stances are gone, you enter and exit battles automatically, and every type of attack an enemy throws out has a specific pose during the wind-up paired with a sound effect that lets you know how to block it. The game is even described as having rhythm-based combat, with musical cues for each type of attack, helping you memorize the block timing. It reminds me of Sekiro more than the original Karateka, as I would find myself humming the timing of when to parry to better learn enemy attacks in that From Software game and in this remake. And I'm not alone in this. I've heard at least one other person describe the rhythm of Sekiro. Earlier, I mentioned how the original game's lack of any wind-up or tails made it hard to counter enemies, but this is the polar opposite. In the first dozen or so fights, I barely took a single hit, as most enemies cycled between the same 1 to 2 attacks, and once you'd memorized the block timing, they took almost no effort. This remake of the, at the time, 28-year-old game feels so static. You basically know every single thing an enemy can do after seeing it once. I felt no tug of war like the original. Even if the enemies still spawn endlessly, it's so simple to dispatch any attacker, you never lose much ground. I felt no haste, no stress outside of the battles. Now, later fights do increase the roster of attacks enemies are able to use and their complexity, so 2/3 of the way through the game, I finally died. At which point I had enough footage and was going to turn the game off until the death animation of my character falling off the cliff showed another climber who flashed back to memories of Mariko, and continued the fight to rescue Mariko where my first character left off, which is such a unique twist on extra lives that I really enjoyed, even more than a pile of dead clones in the remastered version. Then I made it to Akuma, who pummeled me with a flurry of attacks I was not prepared for, and once again I went flying off the cliff only to see another climber. How many suitors does Mariko have? After Akuma beat me to death a second time, I was saddened to see that your high score could be spent for extra lives and no one else would be climbing up the cliff. The other interesting wrinkle in this game is that when rescuing Mariko, she's a little disappointed that her true love didn't make it, and the game encourages you to reach the end with another suitor for better endings. Overall, this feels like an overcorrection. It's almost too easy for 2/3 of the fights, and relied so much on memorizing the grab bag of attacks enemies could draw from. This is something I did and enjoyed in Sekiro, but I had flexibility in attack types. There's no difference in my kicks or punches here, I just mash wildly when my blocks are complete. I will say that this game is much easier to hop into because it does make a lot of changes to feel and play like other modern games. And I did have lots of fun with it because the blocking's satisfying, and even without as much push or pull of the original, making your way through tougher and tougher foes as you get more nervous about making a wrong move does recapture some of the spirit of the original. But I can see why this didn't have the same legacy. This puts it in an odd spot. Fans of the original should probably play the original or the remastered version first. New or curious players, I think, should probably also try the remastered version first. While this remake feels like the one you play if you bounced off the original and the remastered version, but still want to see some of what Karateka does, or if you just want to see a different vision of Karateka. I'm placing this one at a 2 out of 5, nostalgia needed, because while it's much more approachable and translates some of what made the original special, I think it sanded too much off, and might leave some wondering what was so special about Karateka to begin with. But that's all I've got to say about these 3 Karateka games. Do you agree with me and think that this making of and the remastered version are the best ways for newcomers to experience this game? What's been your experience with these games? And would you like to see more playable documentaries like this in the future? Let me know in the comments, I'd love to talk more about this. And send over any suggestions you have for games I should clear off my backlog next. I'm always looking for more votes. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.